from CNN Abu Dhabi, this is Connect the World with Becky Anderson.
This hour, a potentially remarkable turnaround for Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest-serving Israeli Prime Minister, looking to be recrowned as King Bibi. I'm Becky Anderson. Hello and welcome back to the show. After nearly 17 months after he was ousted from office and currently on trial for corruption, Benjamin Netanyahu is on the verge of an emphatic return to power, with the vast majority of votes now counted in Israel's elections. The former Prime Minister's Likud party and its allies are projected to win a majority of seats in Israel's parliament, the Knesset. Now, the current Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, says he wants to wait for the final results before any concession. Those results could be announced later Wednesday or into Thursday. Hadass Gold back with us this hour from Jerusalem. And Benjamin Netanyahu's likely return to power fueled by a far-right surge. Explain.
Well, I mean, just a few years ago, these people were considered the extreme fringe of Israeli politics, but their popularity has grown recently. People say it's partly because some of these right-wing voters have sort of lost their home. Think about Naftali Bennett, once was the Prime Minister of Israel, led a right-wing settler party. His party completely fell apart. They are no longer going to be part of this parliament, so those voters may have gone there. And then also you have Benjamin Netanyahu, his previous coalition governments saw him teaming up with people like the current defense minister Benny Gantz and others across more sort of the centrist parties, less needing to rely on these right-wing parties. But as the years have gone on, he has alienated a lot of these politicians and parties that share his ideology, but because of Benjamin Netanyahu himself, either the personality, either because of burned bridges, either because of the corruption trial, they just outright refuse to sit with him. And then just, what we've seen over the past year is just the really explosion of popularity, especially among young right-wing voters, in these people with the leaders who are like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has been convicted for inciting racism, Bezalel Smotrich, he's one of the other leaders of this party, who once from the Israeli parliament shouted at Arab Israeli members of parliament, saying them that they don't belong there, that they don't belong in Israel. These are members of parliament. They have just grown in popularity. Now they will be the third largest party in the Israeli parliament, according to the numbers we are seeing. The official numbers still have not all been counted, but that's likely what's going to happen. And this will represent a far lurch to the right in the Israeli government. And then the question will be, where will they be in this government? What sort of ministerial positions will these politicians have? Because that could really affect Israeli policy.
And its reputation around the region and the rest of the world. Thank you, Hadass. As we were just discussing there, Benjamin Netanyahu is on course to lead Israel's most right-wing government ever, and some of those making up his coalition are raising eyebrows, namely Itamar Ben-Gvir, a leader of the Jewish Power Party. Now, he has been convicted of inciting racism against Arabs and Palestinians and supporting a terrorist organization. You can see him here in this clip, pulling out a gun in the middle of clashes between Palestinians and Israelis in the highly contentious Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. Israeli TV footage showed him at one point saying, if they throw stones, shoot them. I want to talk more about this with Ofer Kassif. He's part of the Jewish Arab Hadash party in Israel's Knesset. Let's start with these projections at this point. So what do you make of them?
I think that we're facing now a very dangerous era, because this so-called religious Zionism party that was elected and at the moment has about 14, maybe 15 seats in the Knesset out of 120, is a clearly neo-Nazi fraction. People must understand that. It's not a slogan. If we refer solely to the deeds and the ideology and the words of the leaders of this fraction, it's very, very clear that they are more or less like what you can hear in the States from people like maybe Duke, just, change blacks to or African Americans to Palestinians. So it's a very, very dangerous situation.
To what do you put down the surge in support for the far right at present? And indeed, we've seen some of the highest turnouts since 1999, as I understand it. One has to assume that turnout has been for the far right, correct?
Yes, basically yes. First of all, one has to understand that if we count the votes with no reference for a second to the system, how exactly those votes are translated into seats, you can see that the far right, the extreme right, the fascist right, is not much stronger than those who are against it. It's almost 50-50. But because of the specific way of voting, the system in Israel, which is a coalition and a parliamentary system, as you know, so the system translates, so to speak, the votes into seats in a specific way that gives priority at the moment to those fascist fractions. So this is something that must be understood, because not all Israelis and not all Jews in Israel are fascists. Unfortunately, many of them are, and they are powerful now because of different reasons. Now, as to your question, I think that there are two main motivations or incentives to the turnout of those who support the fascist fractions. First is a global one. We can see that in many places around the globe in the last few years, fascist and racist fractions succeed in elections. We saw it recently in Italy, Sweden. We saw it in the United States a few years ago, and of course in Hungary and other places. I think it's a byproduct of the global economic crisis, and especially finding a scapegoat in the image of minorities, either Muslims or refugees or asylum seekers or others. As to the specific and unique situation or circumstances in Israel, there is a long-standing incitement by the far right, led by Netanyahu, against the Palestinian people as a whole, and against the Palestinian national minority within Israel, and the democratic Jews in Israel in particular. So I think those are the main incentives for the turnout and the result.
Okay. Can I talk about the Palestinian citizens of Israel here? I want to talk about what the consequences will be for Arab Israelis under the most right-wing government Israel has ever seen. Before I do that, I do want to just bring up some polling figures, and these are historic figures. And let's just bring them up on the screen, because these show the patterns of Arab citizens' participation in the Knesset elections over the last 2 decades. And you notice that the turnout is significantly lower in the past, and also considerably lower than the national turnout. That speaks to the apathy from the voter, who simply doesn't believe that the government represents them. So as we look at these figures, let's just talk through about the impact for those citizens of this swing to the far right. What are the consequences at this point for them?
Sure, of course, as I said before, there's a great danger at the moment for the Palestinians in particular, but also for myself and my friends among the democratic Jews. We are under continuous death threats, either via the social networks or otherwise, even physically in the streets. I cannot go in my hometown alone in my street for more than 2 years now, and I'm not the only example. So I'm afraid that the continuous pogroms, for instance, that settlers are executing with the support and encouragement of the occupying forces in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, I'm afraid that those are going to penetrate into the state of Israel itself. So I'm afraid that very soon we will see blood in the streets, literally. And this is because, and by the way, just after the results were published yesterday, already some settlers went out throughout occupied East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and began to, again, lynch and pogrom Palestinians because they feel that the wind is behind them, or as I say for many years, fear and hatred are the wind beneath the right wing. And now it's going to be worse, I'm afraid. But at the same time, we in Hadash Ta'al, we are not going to give up. We are going to give them a fight like in the United States in the past, for instance, Martin Luther King and some others gave the KKK. We are in a very similar situation. Add to that the consequences of occupation. We are not going to give up. We are going to give them a real fight.
Let me just put this to you. Yeah, in 2019, Arab parties formed the third largest party in parliament. That was historic. Yeah. This year, your party will only secure about 5 seats. What happened?
Two things. First of all, I'm afraid that we dissolved, unfortunately. We were 4 different parties, very different ideologically speaking, and we succeeded in joining forces, and we succeeded in getting 15 seats, 13 seats. This is one thing, but afterwards, unfortunately, one of the fractions of the parties decided to depart from us, and recently another one departed. And I think those are the main reasons why the turnout of the Palestinian citizens was low.
Let's be quite clear here for our viewers. Yeah, your party was opposed to joining any coalition led by either of the 2 contenders, Benjamin Netanyahu or Yair Lapid. So if you won't join a coalition, and at the moment you're losing members anyway, but if you won't join a coalition, what impact can you realistically have?
Look, one has to understand what is the meaning of a coalition system. There is so-called coalition discipline. That means that if you are, as a party, part of a coalition, you must vote with the government even if you don't like the specific vote that comes to the plenum. In that sense, for instance, one of the parties that departed from us, the Islamic movement that joined the coalition in the last Knesset, voted time and time again with the rightist government, with Bennett and Lieberman and others. So they didn't have any impact or influence. On the other hand, we, as being in the opposition, we didn't have to vote with anyone we didn't like to because there's no opposition discipline. And in that sense, we actually had much more impact than the party that joined the coalition. So this is if we're talking, practically. Of course, it is a matter of principles as well.
Let me just finally ask you this. Palestinians in the West Bank haven't had an opportunity to vote for years. Palestinian Israelis at least get that chance. Whether or not they've turned out this time still remains to be seen in high numbers. But Palestinians in the West Bank haven't had an opportunity to vote. We've seen a really serious uptick in violence. How concerned are you about what we may face in the future? What is that? And how concerned are you that we are looking at a really frightening scenario going forward?
First of all, the Palestinians in the occupied territories under the Israeli occupation cannot vote because Israel doesn't allow them to vote. Let's begin with that. This is an apartheid system, literally. And of course, there's no group, nation, or a class or whatever that lives under horrific oppression like the Palestinians and doesn't, rebel in one or another's stage. And so the rebellion by the Palestinians against the occupation is a matter of time. I'm pretty sure that something like that, like an intifada, is going to, breast, and I'm very afraid of that because no one.
That is very worrying. Yeah, that is very worrying. Finally, your message to the outside world, to the region, to the Arab states around the region, and to the wider world, if indeed we are witnessing what we believe to be the outcome of these elections, which is the most far-right government in history.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for this question, and I surely hope that many people watch my words and listen to my words, including Mr. Biden and senators. We need your help. We actually urgently need your help. Unfortunately, and I said it, with in pain, Israel is on a brink of what Germany was 90 years ago. And this is not a joke. This is not a slogan. We are approaching very, very rapidly towards not just a fascist regime, but a kind of a neo-Nazi regime. If the international community doesn't get involved, this area is going to drown in blood, in rivers of blood. And I urge you, especially the President of the United States and the international community as a whole, do something to prevent such a catastrophe. It's not going to end only in bloodsheds in the Middle East. It's going to spread. And that's going to be too late. If the international community doesn't get involved on the spot, immediately, today, not tomorrow, we're all going to pay the price, especially the Palestinians who are going to face a genocide, and it's going to spread towards other areas, and who knows where, if ever, it's going to stop. Please.
Well, that is a perspective from you. Your analysis important as we consider the results of these elections. The perspective there from our guest. We await to get the final results. Thank you. Well, you can read a lot more news and analysis on these elections. And our Meanwhile in the Middle East newsletter, it drops 3 times a week. There's a story up now on how Benjamin Netanyahu's eyed far-right extremist support to stage a political comeback. One Israeli expert saying after years of political deadlock, a new right-wing government may actually stick. That is CNN.com/Mideast newsletter. Please do sign up. That's an important read. Well, missiles flying and tensions soaring on the Korean peninsula. Why South Korea is accusing Kim Jong-un of crossing the line for the very first time. And is North Korea secretly helping Russia in its war against Ukraine? We'll show you what the US is saying up next. South Korea says the North truly crossed the line this time, firing the most short-range missiles in a single day. Nearly 24 and scores of artillery shots launched into the waters off the eastern west coasts. Officials in Seoul say one missile landed near the South's territorial waters for the first time. Seoul responding with 3 missiles that landed just north of that maritime border. CNN's Selena Wang following the story from Beijing. It is important for you just to explain, if you will, the significance of what we have seen here. This is clearly an uptick at this point.
Well, Becky, as you say, this is an uptick, and not just an uptick, it's a major escalation. This is unprecedented. We're talking in a single day, North Korea firing as many as 23 different types of missiles, including one that flew near South Korean waters that triggered a rare air raid warning on South Korea's Wulongdu Island. In retaliation, South Korea has launched 3 air-to-surface missiles from fighter jets. We are seeing this escalate into a sort of tit for tat. Now, critical here, Becky, is the timing. This escalation comes just 2 days after scheduled U.S. and South Korean joint military exercises that involved hundreds of aircraft. It involved thousands of military personnel from both countries. In response to that, North Korea had called it a rehearsal for an invasion and had threatened even more powerful follow-up measures. What experts are saying is that what we saw today is another response to those joint military exercises and escalating tensions as a pretext for potentially a future even larger provocation. Just last week, the United Nations nuclear watchdog had warned that North Korea could be preparing for a nuclear test. The last one they did was in 2017, and the satellite imagery does show activity at North Korea's underground nuclear test site. Another key point of context here as well is that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has repeatedly vowed to expand the nuclear power, to expand the missile forces, because he sees that as critical to not just regime stability, but also in increasing his leverage in any future discussions with the United States. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is set to meet with his South Korean counterpart at the Pentagon on Thursday. Becky, we know that there is going to be plenty for them to discuss.
Selena, thank you. Well, North Korea may be helping Moscow in its war against Ukraine. This is first on CNN, and the Biden administration is confirming our reporting. The US is accusing Pyongyang of trying to hide shipments of ammunition to Russia, making artillery shells look as if they're being sent to the Middle East or North Africa. Now, this comes as the US applauds Russia's big about face. Moscow says it is now rejoining the Black Sea grain deal, ensuring safe passage for these ships carrying vital food exports from Ukraine. Well, we're live in Kramatorsk in Ukraine, where Nick Robertson is standing by. First, I want to bring in Kylie Atwood, who joins us from the US State Department. What are your sources telling you at this point, Kylie?
Well, listen, what this U.S. officials are saying this morning is that newly declassified intelligence indicates that North Korea has essentially been trying to hide the fact that they are secretly shipping ammunition to Russia. And they're doing that by shipping it to countries in North Africa and the Middle East. Now, the NSC's John Kirby wouldn't confirm today whether or not those pieces of ammunition, that those shells have actually gotten to Russia. They say that the Biden administration is closely monitoring whether or not they have been received. But essentially what the Biden administration is saying here is that North Korea is moving ahead with these plans that they initially revealed were underway back in September. And what this tells us is that Russia is not only turning to Iran for those drones that we have reported that Iran has already sent into Russia, and for the missiles that we expect Iran to send in a short amount of time to Russia, but is also turning to North Korea for ammunition. And when you talk to U.S. officials, they say that these shipments are not going to impact the tide of the war. But experts do say that the fact that this additional ammunition could be actually getting from North Korea to Russia could be a boost for Russia on the battlefield because of how much ammunition they've already gone through. However, we should point out that in the past, North Korea's artillery shells haven't proven to be all that effective. There have been problems with them when they have used them in the past. So just how impactful they would be on the battlefield is something that's yet to be determined. Becky?
Let me just bring in Nick. Kylie, thank you. Nick, you've heard that reporting from Kylie. We've been talking this show about the concerns, the growing concerns, or the significant concerns about the delivery of further weaponry from both potentially North Korea at this stage and also Iran. You're in Kramatorsk. What's the story there?
The story is that Russia is and has reached out within its own community for further resources, manpower, that conscription. The autumn conscription just got underway after the extra special conscription just completed. The Russians say that they put an extra 41,000 troops into the line. We certainly know of the Iranian drones that have been landing already and a concerted effort against the electricity supplies. But I think when you view all of this in the round, what does seem to be happening is Russia is re-equipping with both men and munitions. This war has gone on much longer than they expected. So what we're seeing here around the Kramatorsk area, the Donetsk front, if you will, is significant in this. There has been an increase in Russian bombardment and pressure along many points on the front line here, and a new area in the front line here opened up by Russia for a further push. So sort of three key towns or areas under heavy Russian push at the moment along the front line. A little bit to the north, the Ukrainians seem to be taking some territory, but over a long stretch now, Russia is giving the indication that it's got the armaments and the men now to push back and push along the front line to try to take more of the territory of Donetsk, which they say they intend to take, President Putin's initial plan for Ukraine. So I think what we're seeing is Russia come back, not in territory terms from losses that they've had, not being able to hold the front line better, but actually come back with more men and material to try again. And I think that's where we're at. A heavier bombardment and effort along the front line here is indicative of that.
Nick, while I've got you, I just want to get your perspective on this seeming about turn by Russia in suggesting once again that they will play ball in the UN-brokered grain shipment deal to ensure the grain and other foodstuffs coming out of Ukraine do get to parts of the world that need them most. Is it clear what happened with regard the Kremlin perspective on this?
Hard to say. Quite simply, we know Russia's line on it, which is they've re-engaged because they say they've got a written commitment now from Ukraine that Ukraine won't use its territorial waters or won't use that Black Sea grain corridor in the Black Sea to launch military operations against Russia. It's hard to see that Ukraine would have done that, and Ukraine certainly has not said that that's what it's done, not admitted to the attack in Sevastopol, not admitted to signing some piece of paper that Russia says. I think let's look at what the UN has done here, which is decide to press ahead without Russia. The grain shipments, since Russia said it was suspending, have totaled somewhere in the region of about 700,000 tons of grain this week, some of it World Food Programme grain. Wheat in particular going to Ethiopia. So what the UN has done in a way is call Russia's bluff. They put a bit of a pause on today, but the past couple of days they've sent ships out, used that corridor. Perhaps significantly, President Putin had a conversation with President Erdogan of Turkey yesterday, and their defense chiefs, the ministers of defense, had spoken the day prior. So perhaps some groundwork laid there, but in essence, the weekend Putin said it was all off, that this was suspended indefinitely. But now Russia's complying again. It does seem that they have decided this is not the best option and the best way to get what they want, which is stand outside of a deal, which the UN decided to press ahead with. They, of course, want to get some of their grain to international markets, and the UN had given them sanctions relief to allow that to happen.
Of course. Nick, thank you. Nick is in Kramatorsk in Ukraine. Still to come, supporters of Brazil's outgoing president bring commerce in some areas to a screeching halt. What's being done to get things moving again? And Joe Biden is delivering his closing message to voters ahead of the US midterms. He says the future of American democracy is on the ballot. Some of Brazil's highways are overrun with pro-President Jair Bolsonaro protesters who are creating roadblocks and setting fires. Now, Mr. Bolsonaro's supporters are protesting the presidential election results. Brazil's industry groups say that these roadblocks are delaying supermarket supplies, hospital supplies and fuel shortages. They are calling for an immediate stop to the protests. Well, President Bolsonaro himself broke his silence on Tuesday. He didn't concede defeat, but he said he will follow the Constitution and will start the transition of power. CNN correspondent Paula Newton joins us now from Sao Paulo. We are seeing these protests. They continue despite calls for them to cease. And we have now heard from Bolsonaro. Firstly, your sense of what we heard and why it is that these protests continue.
His statement was vague enough, Becky, that what his protesters took from that was, no, we will continue to stay on the streets here. And that's the issue. What's unfolding now, not just here in Sao Paulo, but in other locations throughout the country, are more protesters out in force, at times blocking roads. Now, the issue here, Becky, is that even Bolsonaro's allies have called for, and in other cases back, the use of force to actually clear these streets. I mean, you just explained the chaos that is going on throughout many parts of the country. That includes here in Sao Paulo, where at times even the entrance to the international airport has been blocked. But obviously, when you start talking about critical supply routes, it's incumbent upon police forces to keep those routes open. This is a national holiday, Becky, and it was really an open question as to whether or not they could get more protesters on the street just because it was a holiday. It seems like they have managed to do that. As you can see, though, those police forces on the streets, whether it's riot police or state military police, and I should say federal highway police as well, trying to clear those protesters. What we saw on the ground, though, Becky, the problem is that they are not arresting people. They are saying you must go to the side of the road. So when we were out yesterday and the night before, we would see encampments by the side of the road. They were staying in place, Becky. They had supplies, they had food, they had water, they had tents. Even if they were moved out from the actual lanes by police, they promised and said to us that they would be back on those roads and would try and paralyze them. I want you to listen now, though, to a protester that we spoke to yesterday after Bolsonaro spoke. Take a listen.
This was a statement where he didn't say anything conclusive. It gives us the impression that there was something wrong with the elections. That is a plus for us to continue our stand and keep protesting.
They say they continue to wait for more news from Bolsonaro on the actual results, even though Bolsonaro himself, we have to say, is not saying that he's contesting the results. Still a very chaotic situation here on the ground, Becky.
Absolutely. Thank you for being there. Sao Paulo, Brazil, is where Paula Newton is for you folks. Thank you. Well, US President Joe Biden may not be on the ballot in next week's midterm elections in the US, but he knows voters will be thinking about him when they pick the next US Congress. And as part of his closing message, the White House just announced that Mr. Biden will be delivering a major address tonight. The topic? The future of American democracy and how it is threatened by election-denying Republicans. Excuse me. Diane Gallagher is in Georgia, where one of the key battles for control of the Senate is unfolding. I'll let you explain.
That's right. And what happened in Georgia with the delay of results being counted is something that we do expect President Joe Biden to talk to the American people about tonight in this speech, telling them that sometimes results can take time to tally, and that does not mean that there is anything going on that is perhaps nefarious in any way. Now, according to White House aides, President Joe Biden is going to deliver these remarks tonight on, quote, preserving and protecting democracy. This is just 6 days before the midterm elections take place here in the United States. But of course, people have been voting in the United States for weeks now. More than 25 million ballots have already been cast. We're told by White House aides that Biden will be delivering this speech near the U.S. Capitol, in part to harken back to January 6, 2021, reminding people of what happened when there was the attack on the Capitol, that insurrection trying to stop the certification of Biden's own win in the 2020 election. We do know that Biden plans to directly address election deniers as well, in light of several Republican candidates here who have openly said that they may not accept the results of the election unless they themselves win their race. Now, look, the timing of this speech obviously comes as midterms are approaching here, or we're really in the thick of voting at this moment, Becky, but also we're told that the president is looking at wanting to address the people in the wake of violence here in the United States that could potentially be coming around this, and that the attack on the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, which authorities say was politically motivated, is part of why they're doing it today.
Absolutely. And thank you for taking over while I had a frog in my throat, as we describe it in Britain. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Coming up, the Iran factor in global tensions, why many believe Tehran is planning to target energy infrastructure in the Middle East. That story is coming up. Also ahead, remembering the victims of the South Korea tragedy. One student says his friend was the kindest person there ever was, as he looks back in sorrow. An exclusive report is up next. As Iran continues its fierce crackdown on protesters, there are fresh concerns on another front. The US and Saudi Arabia fear that Tehran is planning an attack on energy infrastructure in the Middle East, particularly in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That report from a source who says officials in Washington and Riyadh have been sharing intelligence that indicates an attack may be imminent. Well, my next guest says he saw this coming. Karim Sajapur tweeted, and I quote here, "I warned about this last week. Iran's internal vulnerabilities, coupled with perceptions of a US-Saudi rift, have increased the possibility that Tehran may attempt another attack on Saudi Arabia." Well, Karim Sajapur joins me now. He's an Iran expert and a senior associate at the international affairs think tank Carnegie Endowment, a good friend of this show. This is important stuff. Tell us, explain, what do we know at this point?
So there's a couple of things happening, Becky. Internally, Iran is more vulnerable than it's ever been since the 1979 revolution. And one of Iran's sources of vulnerability is news coming from the outside. And this is something that was unexpected. Probably the #1 news channel right now inside Iran is called Iran International, which is a Saudi-supported, London-based satellite news network. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guards essentially issued an ultimatum 2 weeks ago. They said to Saudi Arabia, either shut down Iran International or there will be consequences. The smoke will get in your eyes. At the same time, this is coming at a time of a rift between the United States and Saudi Arabia, rift over oil production, and a perception that the United States perhaps doesn't have Saudi Arabia's back in the same way that it had before. And so the combination of these two factors, I think, has made it a dangerous possibility of Iran trying another attack on Saudi Aramco. They did it in 2019, and they essentially got away with it.
Yeah, they got away with it because, you know, they will believe they got away with it because President Trump, as he was then, great fan and friend of Saudi Arabia, didn't respond in kind. They could be forgiven in Tehran for believing that this rift between the US and Saudi has hit such a nadir that, as you point out, you know, they were correct in thinking that the Americans wouldn't have the Saudis back. That is not clear at this point, is it?
Well, we've seen statements from even prominent moderate centrist Democrats, allies of President Biden, calling for cessation of U.S.-Saudi defense cooperation. And so the Iranians obviously see these things as well. But a rift between the United States and Saudi Arabia is really a lose-lose for both countries, because when Saudi Arabia, when it appears that their chief strategic backer, the United States, no longer has their back, that leaves them vulnerable to Iranian attack. And likewise, if Iran attempts another attack on Saudi Arabia, which disrupts global oil production, that hurts the global economy, that hurts the United States, and it hurts the Democrats' chances of re-election.
Well, as we understand it at CNN, there has been intelligence shared between the US and Saudi, which suggests the threat of an imminent attack at this point. And as you rightly pointed out, the last that we saw of that was only in 2019, and that's clearly a concern. What's the US position today with regard to Tehran? It was only, it feels like weeks. It was a couple of months ago that you and I were still talking about the possibility of the JCPOA talks being concluded and the US and the Iranians back in a nuclear deal together.
I think these nuclear talks are perhaps not quite dead, but they're certainly in a coma for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, is Iran's internal uprising. As long as there are tens of thousands of Iranians taking to the streets throughout the country and Iran is killing its citizens, the United States is going to have a very difficult time providing Iran billions of dollars in sanctions relief. But I think a more recent development, which has been similarly impactful, is Iran sending drones to Vladimir Putin to use against Ukrainian civilians. That has concentrated minds not only in the United States, but also in Europe. The Europeans are now having hesitations about the idea of giving Iran sanctions relief.
I wonder what the impact of these concerns about threats on energy infrastructure around this region. And, and let's be quite clear, there is a lot of energy infrastructure around this region. It isn't just in Saudi Arabia. There's energy infrastructure, of course, here in the UAE and elsewhere. We have seen the mending of ties between a number of Gulf allies, not least the UAE and Gulf countries, not least the UAE and Tehran of late. And the UAE only, again, a couple of months ago suggesting they would return an ambassador to Tehran. What is the impact of these threats on those relations, those regional relations? Because it looked as if things were changing here and that we were seeing the deconflicting this region, as it were.
Well, certainly the United Arab Emirates doesn't want conflict or escalation with Iran. They're 20 times smaller than Iran. The one country, I would say, within the Middle East that's benefited from instability has been Iran. I would say outside the Middle East, the one country that benefits from instability is Russia. And so I think for the United States, Saudi Arabia, UAE, their goal is to try to de-escalate this. But, at a time when Iran feels incredibly vulnerable internally, it's perhaps capable of doing things outside the ordinary.
Karim, it's always good to have you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
We look forward to speaking to you again. It's difficult times, worrying times. Yes, it's always a complicated region, but this is a particularly worrying time. Thank you. Well, as South Korea mourns and seeks answers after a deadly tragedy, the police chief in the Seoul district has been suspended. That's where the crowd surge happened, killing at least 156 people when a Halloween celebration went terribly wrong on Saturday. Police have launched a special investigation, and officials also raided police stations across Seoul, seizing internal reports and documents. Records show police were warned hours before the tragedy about a potentially dangerous situation. Well, most of the victims were youngsters in their 20s, among them 26 foreign nationals, many spending their first semester abroad. CNN's Ivan Watson spoke with survivors and friends of some of those killed. Here's his exclusive report.
Everybody was very fond of Steven. Steven was the kindest person there ever was. He will be there for you. He was a good friend for everybody, a kind soul.
Ian Chang, a 21-year-old from Florida, is talking about his friend Stephen Blessy.
That's me with Stephen.
The two American university students met here in South Korea during their semester abroad in Seoul.
This was one of his big adventures, to come here by himself.
Show me some cooking skills.
The young Americans mixed classwork with exploring Korea.
Yeah, he definitely liked the food here, for sure.
The barbecue.
Yeah, Korean barbecue.
And that included late nights out in Seoul's bars and nightclubs. That is until Saturday night, when everything went horribly wrong.
I didn't thought it was real, the whole thing, because I saw him that day, right? I just learned in the news that he passed away. It just, doesn't seem to be true.
The two Americans planned to meet here in Seoul's Itaewon district to celebrate Halloween. But that night, Korean authorities estimate more than 100,000 other people were also coming to party here.
At the beginning, we thought it was funny.
Stuck in the crowd, Anne-Lou Chevalier. The 22-year-old French exchange student filmed herself with friends, at first laughing. But then she suddenly looks distressed. You were hurt. What happened to you?
At some point I had no air, and we were so crushed to other people that I couldn't breathe at all, so I just passed out.
Unconscious?
Yeah, unconscious.
Bystanders pulled Chevalier limp out of the crowd. She was one of the lucky ones. This narrow alley was ground zero on Saturday night. Hundreds of partygoers collapsed into a deadly pileup here and began suffocating under the weight of the crowd. At least 156 people died. South Korea is still processing this staggering loss. Days later, lost belongings on display for grieving relatives to identify.
So I messaged Steven to tell him, like, hey, don't come to our place anymore.
On Saturday night, Ian Chang got to the crowded neighborhood first and warned his friend not to come. But the Atlanta native, who loved hip-hop and international travel, never answered. The next day, authorities identified Blessy and Ann Gieske, another American student from the same exchange program, as two of the many victims. Just weeks ago, this group of friends went on a weekend hiking trip together.
He was such a great person, like a great friend.
Stephen and Ian shared plans for the future, hopes and dreams that will now never be fulfilled.
I wish I could have made more memories with him, you know. I'm gonna miss him.
Ivan Watson, CNN, Seoul.
We're going to take a very short break. Back after this. Winter in the Gulf region, where I am, is the season of outdoor exhibits and festivals. And one festival that's due to start tomorrow is the Noor Riyadh Festival of Light. So for our parting shots today, we are closing the show on a lighter note. Check this out.
Noor Riyadh is a groundbreaking annual festival of light and art. The festival takes place across the largest city footprint of any light art festival worldwide. The theme of this year's festival is We Dream of New Horizons, centered around a sense of hopefulness for the future with connotations that are positive, optimistic, and reflective of a confidence in renewal and transformation. The exhibition traces the role light plays in shaping our relationship to a world in which light itself has become a signal of change. Exploring themes such as the technologies of light, architectonics of light, and consciousness of light. This exhibition explores a landscape of light inflicted by the rapid culture transformations shaping the Middle East. Noor Riyadh is presented by Riyadh Art Program and plays a central part in the plans to creatively transform Saudi Arabia's capital into a vibrant, cosmopolitan global city through arts and culture. Also, it was the first of Riyadh Art Programs to launch, inaugurating what is becoming the project's legacy of transforming Riyadh to a gallery without walls.
Well, that is really rather fab, isn't it? Thanks for watching wherever you are.